Hello, and welcome to this first chapter for research methods. I'm your instructor, Dr. Gabriel Sines, and hopefully by now you've taken a look at the Module 0 introduction and welcome sort of stuff for the class. Let's get started on the material for the role and importance of research. We're going to be dividing each one of our classes or weeks into a set of shorter, ideally bite-sized sort of videos. So the sections for this week are going to be first, what is research? Introduction to the basic material. Empirical thinking. How do we identify what research is good versus bad? How do scientists try to think and work so that the research that they're producing has valuable information to it? And finally, research and practice. It's going to be a shorter section talking about just kind of the nuts and bolts of research, what different types of research there are, and why those different types of research exist. So let's get started on what is research. Research is the process by which we learn and understand how our world works. Uh, so you may think of research as going online and learning about which cars are the best value to buy. And that is research too, but usually what we talk about in in terms of research is when a scientist sits down and gathers data about the world to see if they can understand something about how it works fundamentally. So research is based off of a series of theories. A theory is just an explanation about how something works, a guess about how something works in the world. And so it's not necessarily a theory about something sciencey like volcanoes. You could have a theory about rocks, or you could have a theory about which car is the most valuable, and which car has the most reliability. What type of person should you be friends with? A hypothesis is a prediction that we use to test a theory. This is where people kind of get confused pretty often because they throw around the word hypothesis left and right. A hypothesis is really designed to see if you can prove a theory right or wrong. In order to have a theory, it needs to be something that can be proven right or wrong. And so we use hypotheses to come up with those guesses based on our theories, and then we test them by gathering data. Let me give you an example. So if you just recently got a new car, and for the first time, it's a car that has the push button ignition system. So I've never dealt with one of these cars. I've always had a key, but if you're dealing with one of these cars and you're trying to learn how it works, you might come up with a theory. Okay, my theory is that so I think that if the car just worked by pushing the button, people would be able to steal it. So I have the theory that the key needs to be close to the car in order for the car to turn on when you push the button. So the hypothesis is that if I have the key far away from the car, then pushing the button will not turn it on. But if I have the key close to the car, then pushing the button will turn it on. So that's a very clear statement that says that's able to check whether the theory is true. Then we would gather data. First, gather data on whether the car turns on when the key is far away versus close. See how far away the key needs to be for the car to stop turning on. See whether or not you can trick the car with other people's keys. Data is just anything that's going to help you understand whether or not your hypothesis was accurate or inaccurate, and therefore check your theory. So, one thing you may be wondering is whether psychology is a science. Depending on the college or university you're in, psychology can sometimes be a liberal art or a humanity. Sometimes it's in STEM, but sometimes it's considered a social science. What makes psychology a science is really the same things uh, that make anything else a science. Psychology uses empiricism. Empiricism is the usage, the production of knowledge from evidence. evidence that we can verify, that we can demonstrate, evidence that we can replicate, or that we can do again and again and again and get the same results. Empiricism can be a little bit of a difficult thing to nail down exactly what it means, but I think everyone can kind of understand the idea of empiricism as being doing research or coming up with ideas based off of evidence, based off things we can prove. So part of the problem with psychology as a science is that it is, kind of weird and inconsistent. People are weird and inconsistent. So how do we deal with that? Well, of course, we're going to use empiricism. But let me take you a step further. In geology, you're going to make theories and hypotheses based off of what happens when you look at rocks. But when we look at ourselves, we kind of know that we have trouble looking at ourselves in a consistent way. And so, but it's should we completely ignore the information that we get from just thinking about ourselves? That thinking about yourself is called introspection. So should we completely ignore our introspection? I'm not sure. Uh, to be honest, there is nothing wrong with coming up with theories based off introspection, and most psychological researchers will come up with theories based off of their own life experiences. Let's take this further. Have you ever heard of an armchair psychologist? An armchair psychologist is a person who sits down, like in an armchair, and thinks about how things work in their own heads and comes up with explanations about people just based off of that thinking. Historically, people in the past did do psychology research basically just by sitting down and thinking about it, using their introspection from their armchair. But we know from the empirical method that you need to gather data, that you need to be able to demonstrate your ideas. And so just because we can't be sure about the ideas that we have about ourselves doesn't mean we can't test them, just like we can test any other idea. I can tell you this right now. Science is not about being right all the time. Instead, it's about checking your ideas and proving them right or wrong, no matter how ridiculous they might seem. Let me give you a couple examples on why introspection and armchair psychology aren't too helpful. So, we could do research just based off of the ideas that we see within ourselves, but how could we understand how babies work? Babies can't talk, and they're really not smart enough to be super aware of the things that are happening within themselves. So, in order to do research on babies, we need to watch babies and see what information they can kind of give us. Now, let me give you this example on how research is done on babies. Just a simple example from one of the friends I had when I was a graduate student. This lady did research on babies, and one of the things that they had figured out is that babies like to look at things that are new to them. How did they figure that out? Empirically. They showed babies things they've never seen before. They showed babies things that they had seen before. And not surprisingly, the babies looked at the new things for longer than the older things. So that little tidbit of information can lead us to further research. For example, it can lead us to understanding what things do babies remember. It can also lead us to what things do babies understand. For example, you could show a baby how a hammer works, and then if you show someone using a hammer in a different way, if the baby understands how the hammer works, then the baby should look at the different use for the hammer longer because something weird is happening. Okay, another example here about research that is sort of empirical. You may have heard of the Baby Einstein Company, which I think is now kind of gone by the wayside. The Baby Einstein Company was a company that basically said your baby can be smarter if they listen to Mozart, if they listen to classical music, especially Mozart. And this actually came from a bit of research, but they never really presented the research to you. And this is where becoming a good consumer of research comes in. This is why you want to take this class. A lot of people spent a bunch of money on buying these CDs that were supposed to be tailored for babies, and they would play a bunch of Mozart for babies, and they would think that their baby would get smarter. Here's where the research actually came into play. The research that this company used to base this idea looked like this. People put rats in a maze, and they played music for the rats. They either played no music, they played Mozart, or they played heavy metal. And so the rats did better in the mazes when they had Mozart versus heavy metal. Now, I can promise you that heavy metal is probably a little scary and confusing for rats compared to Mozart. I don't remember exactly, but I think the rats did better with no music than with Mozart, or maybe they did the same with no music than with Mozart. I don't remember. But the point is that if you had actually checked this research, you would maybe think twice about purchasing a baby Einstein CD. I can understand that maybe Mozart, you could come up with the conclusion that maybe Mozart makes rats smarter, and that therefore maybe babies are kind of like rats, and that therefore babies could become smarter with Mozart, but that's a real long stretch. A better thing to say would be that babies would probably be alarmed by heavy metal in the same way that babies would probably be less alarmed by Mozart, just like rats. So that's a really simple example to understand why this class is so important, why it's important to check the evidence behind the research claims. So just a quick rundown, kind of what I was just talking about. As people, as educated, responsible adults, you should be consumers of research. Whenever you hear on the news about some research, whenever you read a blog post about it, whenever a product tries to sell you something based off of research, you should be able to check that research and wisely critique whether or not the research and the evidence make sense for the claims that are being made. Now, by taking this class, you are taking a step towards being a producer of research, learning how to perform research and produce and publish research. But you're not really going to be all the way there yet. Producers of research are people who have masters and doctoral degrees. That's their job. It's their career to produce research. That being said, there's nothing wrong with you doing research on your own. Say, for example, if you want to learn, or if you have a theory about how people work, there's nothing wrong with you gathering data and getting your findings together for it. The important thing is that you don't just pass it off as published research. But also, it's important that you don't just assume that published research is always right. I promise you that there's research from the 1940s that is totally, completely wrong now, but that at the time was our best educated guess. That doesn't mean that all modern research is wrong, but it's important to recognize that it is an educated guess. So it can be really, really hard to be a consumer of good research, or a good research consumer. What During the course of this class, you'll learn quite a few things that can help you be better at consuming research, help you think more intelligently about research and the world around you. Some things that can help you are to avoid examples as data. Gosh, what does that mean? Well, let's say that you say, um, I don't know whether hitting my kids is a good way to teach them to be respectful. But I know that when I grew up and I got spanked, that made me more respectful. Therefore, it's probably a good method of raising your kids. That is a mistake because you assume that one or a few examples are a good demonstration of how something works. In order to identify whether that corporal punishment is a good way to educate your children, what you really need is a broad range of data, and not just whether or not one person came out well, but whether or not that person had a stable emotional experience, whether or not using just conversation with your kids worked just as well or better. Confirmation bias is the idea that people will seek out evidence that proves them right. So if you've probably heard of people who believe that vaccines are bad for you. I promise that yes, there are some problems with vaccines, but on the whole, they are so much better for society than they are problematic. But if you think that vaccines are better for you, you're probably going to go on the internet and look for information that proves you right. That is a mistake and can very easily lead you to making conclusions that feel empirically based but actually are not very accurate. Like I said previously, science is not about being right, it's about being skeptical about your ideas. And so a good researcher will always try to prove themselves wrong. Oversimplification, and there are many other types of logical fallacies that you can have in research. Oversimplification is the idea that uh, you take an idea and you make it so simple and broad that it no longer makes any sense. For example, I believe that we should avoid putting people in jail and we should try to focus on rehabilitating uh, people who have done crimes. Now, does that mean that I think nobody should go to jail or that crime should never be punished? No, not really. But somebody who hears my ideas may oversimplify them to that state and decide that they're ridiculous. That's not necessarily the point. And so, a lot of what research is going to be about, a lot of the difficulty with research is making sure that you get your point across clearly and completely. The replication crisis is something I'd like to just mention very, very briefly and kind of ties in with changing times. In the last 10 to 20 years, psychology has noticed that a lot of research that exists from the past was wrong because people did their best to do research but were swayed by trying to publish. It's important to try and publish research because the more you publish, the better off your career goes. But also, that can push you to publish research that is less than perfect. The replication crisis is where a bunch of psychologists try to replicate old research. Replicate meaning they just do the same experiment and see if they get the same results. But the replications failed. They found different results. And that's a problem because science builds off of other science. And so now we have this situation where we're not sure about a lot of the things that we used to be sure about because we had not achieved a good level of empiricism in the past. It's something that we're working through, and it doesn't mean that psychology is a bogus science, but it does mean that we need to double down on how rigorous our research is. And for you as a consumer, you need to be extra careful about how you think about research, and you need to do your best to learn how to criticize research on your own. Okay, that section was a little bit longer than I intended to make it, so I'm going to try and keep all these videos down to about 10 minutes or less, but hopefully this information was useful to you, and there should be a activity or something for you to work on some of this information so that it makes a little bit more sense, or so that can help you remember the information that you just went through. Alright, I'll see you, or hear you, or maybe speak to you in the next video. Ciao!